My name is Dorothy Kellerman, and I'm 68 years old. I've lived in the same rent-stabilized apartment in Manhattan's Upper West Side for over 40 years. I always believed that family meant inclusion, respect, and being valued for who you are. But one chilly October evening, I discovered that my own children had been planning my 69th birthday celebration behind my back, making decisions about my life, my party, and my future without consulting me once. They treated me like I was already invisible, already irrelevant. I stayed quiet, I listened, and then I reminded them exactly who owned the apartment they'd been taking for granted all these years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Kellerman, though everyone who knows me calls me Dot. At 68, I've become one of those rare New Yorkers who can say they've truly seen the city transform before their eyes. I've lived in the same fourth-floor walk-up apartment on West 78th Street since 1983, back when this neighborhood was still rough around the edges, and you could actually afford to live in Manhattan on a social worker's salary. The apartment itself isn't much to look at from the outside. A pre-war building with a faded brick facade and a fire escape that zigzags down like a metal spine. But inside, it's home in every sense of the word. High ceilings with original crown molding, hardwood floors that creak in all the familiar places, and windows that face east so I catch the morning sun as it cuts between the buildings. The kitchen is tiny by today's standards, barely wide enough for two people to pass each other, but it has character original 1940s tile backsplash and a porcelain sink deep enough to wash a turkey. I moved here with my late husband Walter when we were newlyweds, both of us fresh out of graduate school and full of dreams about changing the world. Walter was studying to become a public defender, and I had just started my career as a social worker with the city's children's services. We were broke but happy, splitting a rent that seemed enormous at the time, minus $400 a month, but which now feels like winning the lottery every day I wake up here. Walter passed away 12 years ago from a sudden heart attack. One morning he was reading the Times at our small breakfast table, commenting on the crossword puzzle, and by evening he was gone. The grief nearly broke me, but this apartment held me together. Every corner contains a memory of our life together. The living room where we danced to Motown records on Saturday nights, the bedroom where we whispered our dreams and fears, the kitchen where he taught me to make his grandmother's marinara sauce from scratch. After Walter died, I thought about moving somewhere smaller, somewhere that didn't echo with his absence. But my children, Rebecca and Anthony, convinced me to stay. "Mom, this place is part of our family history," Rebecca had said, her arm around my shoulders as we stood looking out at the street. Plus, do you know how impossible it would be to find another rent-stabilized apartment like this? You'd be crazy to give it up. She was right, of course. My rent, thanks to New York's stabilization laws, had only increased modestly over the decades. What would cost someone $4,500 a month today, I pay $1,200 for. It's an anomaly in modern Manhattan, a relic of a different era when working-class people could actually afford to live in the city they served. Rebecca, now 42, works in marketing for a tech startup downtown. She's always been the organized one, the planner, inheriting Walter's methodical nature and my stubborn streak. She lives in a sleek one-bedroom in Williamsburg that costs more per month than I used to make in a year. She's married to Trevor, a graphic designer who seems pleasant enough but always looks slightly uncomfortable when he visits, as if he's afraid he might catch something from the old building. Anthony, 39, followed a different path. He's a freelance photographer who specializes in real estate photography. Ironic, considering he's never been able to afford a place of his own in the city. He's been bouncing between expensive shares in Brooklyn and Queens for years, always 1 month away from financial disaster but too proud to admit he's struggling. He's charming and creative, but he inherited my impulsive nature without the practical foundation that kept me grounded. Both of my children visit regularly, though I've noticed their visits have become more calculating in recent years. They ask pointed questions about my health, my finances, my long-term plans. Rebecca particularly seems fascinated by the apartment itself, commenting on the rising property values in the neighborhood, mentioning articles she's read about the rent stabilization laws potentially changing, asking detailed questions about my lease agreement. At first, I attributed this to natural concern. They're adults now, responsible people who worry about their aging mother living alone in a fourth-floor walk-up. The stairs are getting harder for me, that's true. My knees protest more loudly each morning, and I've had to install a second handrail along the stairwell. But I'm far from helpless. I still walk to the grocery store on Broadway, still volunteer at the community center on Amsterdam Avenue, still meet my friend Ruth for coffee every Tuesday at the same diner we've been going to for 15 years. My daily routine has a rhythm that grounds me. I wake up early, a habit from decades of social work that required me to be at the office by 7 a.m., and make my coffee in the same blue ceramic mug Walter bought me for our 10th anniversary. I sit by the east-facing window in the living room, watching the city wake up below me. The dog walkers emerge first, followed by the joggers, then the commuters rushing toward the subway with their travel mugs and determined expressions. I spend my mornings reading the Times, library books, letters from old colleagues who've scattered across the country in retirement. In the afternoons, I might walk through Central Park, just a few blocks away, or browse the bookstores on Broadway. Evenings often find me on the building's roof, which offers a surprisingly good view of the Hudson River between the newer construction. The neighborhood itself has gentrified dramatically around me. The bodega where I used to buy my groceries is now an artisanal cheese shop. The laundromat became a boutique selling $200 sweaters. Young professionals in their 20s and 30s move in and out of the surrounding buildings like a tide, staying a year or two before moving on to bigger apartments or different neighborhoods or different cities entirely. I've become something of a neighborhood curiosity, the old lady who's been here longer than anyone can remember, who knows the history of every building and remembers when you could park on the street without feeding a meter. The newer residents are polite but distant, nodding hello in the hallway but never really seeing me as anything more than a quaint remnant of the neighborhood's past. My finances are stable, if not lavish. My city pension, combined with Social Security and the small life insurance policy Robert left me, covers my modest expenses comfortably. I own the contents of the apartment outright, and my rent-stabilized lease is ironclad, one of the last truly protected tenancies in the building. The management company has tried subtle pressure over the years, offering buyouts that started small but have grown increasingly tempting as the neighborhood's value has skyrocketed. I've never seriously considered their offers. This apartment isn't just where I live, it's the foundation of everything I've built. It's where I raised my children, where I grieved my husband, where I learned to be alone without being lonely. The walls hold 40 years of Christmas mornings, birthday parties, quiet dinners, and loud arguments. You can't put a price on that kind of history. But I've begun to sense that my children see things differently. They look at this apartment and see dollar signs, opportunity, potential. They see an elderly woman holding on to something too valuable for her to fully appreciate or utilize. They've started speaking about my future in ways that make me feel like a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be loved. Recently, their visits have taken on a different quality. They arrive with barely concealed agendas, steering conversations toward topics I'm not entirely comfortable discussing. Rebecca brings Trevor along more often now, and I've noticed him taking careful note of the apartment's details, the original fixtures, the crown molding, the layout. Anthony asks questions about the building's management, about my relationship with my neighbors, about whether I've had any issues with the landlord. I've started to feel like a stranger in my own life, watching my children circle around decisions they seem to think are theirs to make. The apartment that has always been my sanctuary is beginning to feel like a stage where I'm no longer directing the performance. But I'm not naive, and I'm certainly not helpless. 40 years of social work taught me to read people, to recognize patterns, to spot manipulation, even when it's wrapped in good intentions. I know something is brewing, something that involves me but excludes my voice. I can feel it in the careful way they phrase their questions, in the glances they exchange when they think I'm not looking, in the sudden interest they've developed in my daily routines and future plans. The October air carries a chill that reminds me winter is coming, but I'm not afraid of the cold. I've weathered worse storms than whatever my children might be planning. This apartment has been my fortress for 4 decades, and I intend to keep it that way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was a gray Thursday afternoon in mid-October when my carefully constructed world began to crack. The kind of day where the sky hangs low and heavy over Manhattan, threatening rain but never quite delivering. I had been invited to what I thought was a casual coffee gathering at my longtime friend Eleanor Vasquez's apartment on the Upper East Side, a monthly tradition we'd maintained for nearly 15 years. Eleanor lived in a beautiful pre-war building on East 86th Street, the kind with a doorman who actually remembered your name and marble floors that echoed with decades of elegant footsteps. Her apartment was smaller than mine but impeccably decorated, filled with photographs from her travels and carefully curated antiques that spoke of a woman who had lived fully and intentionally. What I hadn't expected was to find myself in the middle of what felt more like a strategy session than a social visit. Eleanor had invited several women from our extended circle: Patricia Chen from the community center, Gloria Martinez, who lived 2 buildings down from me, and, surprisingly, Diane Sullivan, Rebecca's former college roommate who now worked as an event planner in Midtown. I should have sensed something was off from the moment I walked in. The conversation felt stilted, forced, with too many meaningful glances exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. Eleanor served tea in her good china, the set she usually reserved for special occasions, and there was an undercurrent of nervous energy that made my skin prickle with unease. We settled into Eleanor's living room, the afternoon light filtering through her sheer curtains and casting long shadows across the Persian rug. The conversation meandered through the usual topics: the weather, local neighborhood changes, upcoming holidays. But I noticed how quickly certain subjects were dropped, how carefully words were chosen, how the women seemed to be performing rather than simply talking. It was when Patricia excused herself to use the restroom, and Gloria stepped onto the balcony to take a phone call that I overheard it. Eleanor and Diane were speaking in the kitchen, their voices lowered but not quite enough. I was sitting close to the pass-through that connected the living room to the kitchen, innocently leafing through a coffee table book about Italian gardens, when their words reached me with devastating clarity. "Rebecca is really stressed about the whole situation," Diane was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when discussing someone they believe can't hear them. "She's been calling me almost every week, trying to figure out how to handle this birthday thing without making Dot feel, pushed aside." Eleanor's response made my blood run cold. "Well, it's sweet that she wants to include her, but honestly, at some point you have to make practical decisions." Rebecca showed me the guest list they're working on. "It's mostly Rebecca and Anthony's friends anyway. People their age. Dot would probably feel out of place." "That's what Rebecca said," Diane continued, and I could hear the sound of spoons clinking against teacups. "She feels terrible about it, but she thinks it would be better to do something small and intimate for Dot separately. Maybe just family dinner or something quiet. The real party, the one where people actually want to celebrate and have fun, that should be for the people who really matter to Rebecca and Anthony's lives now." The book slipped from my hands, but I caught it before it could hit the floor. My heart was hammering so hard I was certain they would hear it from the kitchen. Eleanor's voice dropped even lower. "And honestly, it makes sense from a practical standpoint, too. Dot's apartment is becoming such a valuable asset. Rebecca mentioned that similar units in the building have been selling for over $2 million when they become available. If something happened to Dot, when something eventually happens, that rent-stabilized lease dies with her." "Right," Diane agreed. "Rebecca said she and Trevor have been looking at condos in the area, but everything decent is so expensive. Anthony's been struggling financially too. That photographer thing isn't really working out for him. Rebecca thinks they need to start having conversations with Dot about the future, about maybe moving somewhere more appropriate for someone her age." I felt something cold and sharp settle in my stomach. This wasn't about my birthday at all. This was about my life, my home, my future, being discussed and decided by people who saw me as an obstacle to their own plans. Eleanor sighed audibly. "It's such a difficult situation. These older buildings, these rent-stabilized leases, They're like lottery tickets now. But the people holding them. She trailed off, and I could practically hear the shrug in her voice. Rebecca feels guilty, Diane said. She loves her mother, but she's also thinking about her own future. And Anthony's. They've been putting together ideas for how to approach this whole birthday celebration in a way that maybe starts those conversations naturally. You know, about aging in place, about whether Dot really needs all that space, about what would be best for everyone involved. The phrase, best for everyone involved, hit me like a physical blow. How many times had I heard those exact words in my social work career? How many times had I watched families use that phrase to justify decisions that benefited them at the expense of the vulnerable person they claimed to be protecting? Patricia returned from the bathroom at that moment, and the conversation in the kitchen immediately shifted to safer topics: the weather, dinner plans, neighborhood gossip. But the damage was done. I had heard enough to understand that my 69th birthday wasn't being planned as a celebration of my life, but as a strategic opportunity to begin dismantling it. I stayed for another hour, going through the motions of polite conversation while my mind raced. I smiled when expected, laughed at appropriate moments, contributed to discussions about local restaurants and upcoming elections. But internally, I was cataloging every detail of what I had overheard, analyzing the implications, beginning to understand the scope of what my children had been planning behind my back. When I finally left Eleanor's apartment, the October air felt sharper than it had when I arrived. I walked slowly toward the subway, my mind churning with questions and a growing sense of betrayal that made my chest feel tight and hollow at the same time. The train ride back to the Upper West Side gave me time to process what I had learned. My children weren't just planning a birthday party without me, they were planning my future without me. They had already decided that I was too old, too much of a burden, too inconvenient to their own ambitions. They saw my rent-stabilized apartment not as my home, but as their inheritance, and they were growing impatient, waiting for nature to take its course. As the subway car swayed and clattered through the tunnels beneath Manhattan, I stared at my reflection in the dark window and saw something I hadn't noticed before. Not frailty, not confusion, not the helpless elderly woman my children apparently saw when they looked at me. I saw anger. Clear, focused, righteous anger. By the time I climbed the 4 flights of stairs to my apartment, my hands were steady and my mind was sharp. I unlocked my door, hung my coat in the hall closet, and walked into my living room in my apartment, filled with my memories and my choices. I sat down at the small secretary desk by the window, the same desk where Walter and I used to pay bills and plan our modest vacations, and pulled out a legal pad. At the top of the page, I wrote October 18th and underlined it twice. Then I began to write down everything I had overheard, every detail I could remember. Not because I was planning to confront anyone, not yet, but because I needed to see it all laid out in black and white. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I decided how to respond. As I wrote, the afternoon light faded, and the sounds of the city settling into evening drifted up from the street below. Somewhere out there, my children were probably having dinner, maybe discussing their latest strategies for managing their aging mother's inconvenient attachment to her own life. They had no idea that their carefully laid plans were about to encounter a significant obstacle: me. I was far from the helpless old woman they thought they were protecting. I was a woman who had spent 4 decades advocating for people who couldn't advocate for themselves, who had learned to navigate complex systems and bureaucracies, who understood exactly how power worked and how to use it. They wanted to plan my birthday without me? Fine. I would let them. But while they were focused on their party planning, I would be planning something much more significant. I would be planning to remind them exactly who owned the lease on this apartment, who made the decisions about my life, and who would determine how this story ended. The pen felt solid and familiar in my hand as I continued writing, documenting not just what I had heard but what I intended to do about it. Outside my window, Manhattan glittered with millions of lights, each one representing someone fighting their own battles, making their own choices, refusing to be invisible. I was about to join their ranks. The morning after my revelation at Eleanor's apartment, I woke up before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 4:47 a.m., but sleep was impossible. My mind was racing with the implications of what I had discovered, and more importantly, with the possibilities of what I could do about it. I made my coffee earlier than usual and settled into my favorite chair by the east-facing window, watching the city slowly emerge from darkness. But instead of my usual peaceful contemplation, I found myself studying my surroundings with new eyes. Not as a comfortable grandmother enjoying her retirement, but as a strategic thinker, assessing her assets and vulnerabilities. The apartment that had always felt like a sanctuary now revealed itself as something much more powerful. It was my trump card. For the first time, I truly understood what Rebecca and Anthony saw when they looked at this place. Not just a home, but a multi-million-dollar piece of Manhattan real estate that could solve all their financial problems. If only their stubborn mother would cooperate. I pulled out my laptop, a relatively recent purchase that had initially intimidated me, but which I'd gradually mastered with the help of YouTube tutorials and patient librarians. What I discovered during my morning research session changed everything I thought I knew about my own situation. Rent-stabilized apartments on the Upper West Side weren't just valuable, they were practically extinct. Units similar to mine, when they occasionally became available, were indeed selling for prices that made my head spin. Two-bedroom apartments in my building, when freed from rent stabilization, were listing for $2.8 million. Three-bedroom units like mine were approaching $3.5 million. But more importantly, I learned about something called succession rights. As the primary tenant on a rent-stabilized lease, I had the legal authority to designate a family member to inherit my tenancy, but only if they met specific criteria about residency and dependency. Rebecca and Anthony, with their own apartments and independent incomes, wouldn't qualify. That meant that when I died, my lease would die with me. The apartment would return to the landlord, who could then renovate and rent it at market rates. My children would inherit nothing except whatever personal possessions I chose to leave them. Unless, of course, they could convince me to add one of them to the lease while I was still alive, or persuade me to voluntarily surrender my tenancy in exchange for a buyout that we would all share. Suddenly, their recent behavior made perfect sense. The questions about my health, the concerns about me living alone, the suggestions about easier living arrangements in senior communities. It was all leading toward the same goal. They needed me to make a decision that would benefit them financially, and they were willing to manipulate my birthday celebration to create the emotional pressure necessary to achieve that goal. I spent the next few hours diving deeper into my research, learning about tenant rights, succession laws, and the various tactics landlords use to pressure rent-stabilized tenants into giving up their leases. I read forum posts from other elderly tenants who had faced similar pressure from both landlords and family members. The stories were depressingly familiar. Adult children who suddenly became very concerned about their parents' welfare when valuable real estate was involved. But I also found resources, legal aid organizations that specialized in tenant rights, advocacy groups for senior citizens facing housing pressure, even a support group for older adults dealing with financial manipulation by family members, a problem apparently so common that it had its own name: family financial abuse. By noon, I had filled 3 pages of my legal pad with notes, phone numbers, and potential strategies. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was informed. And information, as any good social worker knows, is the first step toward empowerment. Mamaxe, I decided to test my theories before taking any dramatic action. Over the next few days, I began paying closer attention to my children's behavior, listening more carefully to their words, watching for the subtle signs I had missed before. Rebecca called that Friday, ostensibly to check on my plans for the weekend. But I noticed how quickly she steered the conversation toward my building's recent management changes. How casually she mentioned reading an article about elderly people who had been taken advantage of by unscrupulous landlords. She painted a picture of me as vulnerable, surrounded by potential threats that only she and Anthony could protect me from. "You know, Mom," she said in that carefully concerned tone she'd perfected, "Trevor and I were talking, and we really think you should consider having one of us added to your lease. Just as a safety measure. You never know what could happen with these management companies. They're always looking for ways to push out rent-stabilized tenants." I made non-committal sounds, thanked her for her concern, and promised to think about it. But privately, I was furious. She was using my own protective instincts against me, framing their financial opportunism as care for my welfare. Anthony visited that Sunday, arriving with expensive takeout from a trendy Italian place in Soho. The kind of gesture that seemed generous until you remembered he was supposedly struggling financially. He spent the afternoon taking photos of the apartment, claiming he was documenting family memories for a photo album he was creating. But I noticed which angles he chose, how he focused on the original architectural details, the way he measured rooms with his eyes like the real estate photographer he was. When he thought I was in the kitchen, I caught him on his phone, clearly texting photos to someone. "This place really is special, Mom," he said as we sat at my small dining table eating overpriced pasta. "But it's so much work for you now. All these stairs, the maintenance issues, dealing with the building management. Don't you ever think about finding somewhere more manageable?" There was that word again. Manageable. As if I were a problem that needed to be solved rather than a person living her own life. I smiled and nodded, playing the role they expected me to play. But internally, I was cataloging every manipulation, every false concern, every carefully planted suggestion. They weren't just planning my birthday without me, they were planning my entire future without me. That evening, after Anthony left, I made my first strategic phone call. The legal aid organization I had researched offered free consultations for senior citizens facing housing issues. I scheduled an appointment for the following Tuesday, using a fake name and paying with cash. I wasn't ready to officially involve lawyers yet, but I needed to understand exactly what my rights were and what options I had. I also began documenting everything. Every phone call, every visit, every suggestion about my housing situation went into a notebook I kept locked in my bedroom dresser. If this situation escalated, I wanted a clear record of their attempts to manipulate me. But most importantly, I started planning my counterattack. If Rebecca and Anthony wanted to use my birthday as an opportunity to advance their agenda, I would let them. I would attend their party, smile for their photos, and let them believe their strategy was working. And while they were congratulating themselves on their successful manipulation, I would be putting into motion a plan that would teach them exactly what happened when you underestimated Dorothy Kellerman. I had spent 40 years advocating for people who couldn't advocate for themselves. I had fought bureaucrats, lawyers, and systems designed to exploit the vulnerable. I had won more battles than I had lost, and I had never backed down from a fight when the stakes mattered. My children were about to learn that their mother was far from the helpless old woman they thought they were managing. They wanted to plan my future? Fine. But I would be planning theirs. The war for my life had begun, and I intended to win it. The legal aid office was located in a nondescript building on East 14th Street, squeezed between a bodega and a dry cleaner. I arrived 15 minutes early for my Tuesday appointment, partly from habit and partly from nerves. This was my first concrete step toward protecting myself, and I wanted to make sure I approached it correctly. The waiting room was small and crowded, filled with people who looked like they were fighting their own battles against systems designed to overwhelm them. Elderly tenants clutching eviction notices, young mothers with housing complaints, construction workers dealing with workplace injuries. I felt a familiar solidarity with these people, the same feeling I used to get when I was the social worker sitting across from families who needed an advocate. Except now, I was the one who needed help. Maria Santos, the attorney assigned to my case, was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s, but her handshake was firm, and her eyes were sharp with intelligence. Her office was barely larger than a closet, with law books stacked on every available surface and files organized in a system that probably made sense only to her. "So, Dorothy," she said, settling behind her desk with a yellow legal pad, "tell me about your situation." I had rehearsed this conversation during the subway ride downtown, but actually saying the words out loud felt strange. My children are trying to pressure me into giving up my rent-stabilized apartment. They're using my upcoming birthday as an opportunity to have conversations about my future, but what they really want is access to a multi-million-dollar piece of real estate. Maria nodded, making notes. "How long have you lived in the apartment?" 40 years. I'm the primary leaseholder. My late husband, Walter, was the co-signer originally, But when he died, the lease transferred fully to me. And your children? Do they currently live with you or depend on you financially? No. Rebecca lives in Williamsburg with her husband, and Anthony has his own place in Queens. They're both adults with independent incomes. Maria looked up from her notes, and I saw something that might have been relief in her expression. Dorothy, I have good news for you. Based on what you've told me, your children have no legal claim to your tenancy, either now or after your death. Succession rights for rent-stabilized apartments have very specific requirements, and independent adult children don't qualify. The weight I had been carrying in my chest for weeks suddenly felt lighter. So they can't force me to add them to the lease? Absolutely not. You're the sole tenant, and any changes to the lease require your voluntary consent. No one can compel you to modify your tenancy. Maria leaned forward, her tone becoming more serious. But Dorothy, I need to ask, are they applying any other forms of pressure, financial manipulation, threats, withholding care or support? I thought about the careful way Rebecca phrased her concerns, the strategic timing of Anthony's visits, the way they both seemed to be building a case for my incompetence. Nothing that obvious, it's more psychological. They're trying to convince me that I'm not capable of living independently, that I need their help to manage my affairs. That's actually very common, Maria said grimly. Family financial abuse often starts with undermining the older person's confidence in their own judgment. The goal is to make you feel like you need their guidance, so when they suggest major changes, like giving up your apartment, it seems like caring advice rather than manipulation. She pulled out a thick folder and handed me several pamphlets. I want you to read these materials about elder financial abuse and tenant rights. But more importantly, I want you to start documenting everything. Every conversation, every suggestion, every time they try to discuss your housing situation. If this escalates, we'll need evidence. I told her about the notebook I had already started, and she approved. Good instincts. Also, I'm going to give you the contact information for a few other resources. A geriatric care manager who can do an independent assessment of your capabilities, and a financial advisor who specializes in protecting seniors from family exploitation. As I prepared to leave, Maria handed me her business card. Dorothy, I want you to remember something. You're not a burden, you're not incompetent, and you're not obligated to sacrifice your security for your children's financial benefit. What you're describing is your children trying to solve their own money problems by taking your home away from you. That's not love, that's exploitation. Her words stayed with me during the subway ride home. For the first time since overhearing that conversation at Eleanor's apartment, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. The next phase of my plan involved a more delicate investigation. I needed to understand exactly how desperate my children's financial situations were, because that would determine how aggressive their tactics might become. I started with social media, something I had resisted for years but finally embraced out of necessity. Rebecca's Instagram account was a carefully curated display of her lifestyle: expensive restaurants, weekend trips to the Hamptons, designer handbags. Either she was doing much better financially than she claimed, or she was living far beyond her means. Anthony's online presence told a different story. His photography portfolio was impressive, but the gaps between posts suggested irregular work. His apartment shares and constant moving indicated someone struggling to afford stable housing in an expensive city. I also began making casual inquiries with mutual acquaintances. Eleanor, despite her participation in what I now thought of as the coffee shop conspiracy, was actually a good source of information when approached carefully. Rebecca seems to be doing so well, I mentioned during one of our phone conversations. That new apartment in Williamsburg must be expensive. Oh, it is, Eleanor replied. Trevor mentioned they're paying over $4,000 a month. Plus, Rebecca's been talking about wanting to buy something, but you know how impossible that is in this market. She'd need a significant down payment. $4,000 a month. That was more than triple what I paid for my much larger apartment. No wonder Rebecca was so interested in my housing situation. I learned more about Anthony's struggles through Patricia at the community center, who knew someone who worked with freelance photographers. The real estate photography market is oversaturated, she told me. There's good money in it, but only for the photographers who have steady contracts with agencies. The freelancers are constantly scrambling. Armed with this information, I began to see my children's recent behavior in a new light. This wasn't just about greed. It was about financial desperation disguised as concern for my welfare. Over the next week, I put several other pieces of my defense strategy into place. I opened a new checking account at a different bank, one that only I could access. I gathered all my important documents, lease agreements, insurance policies, medical records, and stored copies in a safe deposit box that my children didn't know existed. I also contacted my doctor and requested a comprehensive cognitive assessment. If Rebecca and Anthony were going to question my mental capacity, I wanted independent medical documentation of my competence. Dr. Jennifer Park had been my physician for over 10 years, and she seemed puzzled by my request. "Dorothy, is there something specific you're concerned about? You seem as sharp as ever to me." I explained the situation carefully, and her expression shifted from confusion to anger. "I see this more often than I'd like," she said. Adult children who suddenly become very concerned about their parents' mental state when there's money involved. "Let's get you a full neuropsychological evaluation. I'll refer you to the best geriatric psychiatrist in the city." The appointment was scheduled for the following week, just days before my birthday celebration. Perfect timing. By the end of October, I had built what Maria Santos called a legal fortress around my life. I had documented evidence of my children's manipulation, independent medical verification of my mental capacity, secure financial accounts they couldn't access, and legal representation if things escalated. Most importantly, I had a plan for my birthday party. A plan that would teach Rebecca and Anthony exactly what happened when you underestimated Dorothy Kellerman. I was ready for whatever they had planned for me. The question was, were they ready for what I had planned for them? The invitation arrived on thick cream cardstock, delivered by hand to my apartment on a crisp November morning. Rebecca must have had it professionally printed, my name written in elegant script, the details laid out like a formal event announcement. "In celebration of Dorothy Kellerman's 69th birthday," it read, followed by an address I didn't recognize in Chelsea, not my apartment, not a restaurant I had chosen, not even a venue I had any connection to. They were throwing my birthday party at a location I had never seen, for people I might not even know, without consulting me about a single detail. I sat at my kitchen table, studying the invitation like evidence in a case I was building, which, in many ways, it was. The venue was listed as the Morrison Event Space on West 23rd Street. A quick Google search revealed it to be one of those trendy industrial chic spaces that specialized in corporate events and upscale private parties. The kind of place that cost serious money to rent. The guest list, printed on a separate card, was telling. I recognized maybe half the names. There was family, of course. Rebecca and Trevor, Anthony, a few cousins I rarely saw. But the majority were people from Rebecca and Anthony's lives. Colleagues, friends, even some of Trevor's business associates. It read less like a celebration of my life and more like a networking opportunity that happened to have a birthday theme. What struck me most was what wasn't mentioned anywhere on the elegant invitation: my preferences, my input, my choices. This party was being thrown in my honor, but it had been planned as if I were already dead, and they were organizing my memorial service. I called Rebecca that afternoon, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Oh, Mom, you got the invitation," she said, and I could hear the forced cheerfulness in her tone. "We wanted to surprise you with something really special this year." "It's very thoughtful," I replied. "Though I don't think I know this venue. How did you choose it?" There was a slight pause before Rebecca answered. "Trevor found it. He has a client who used it for a corporate event. It's supposed to be beautiful. Very elegant, great for photos, and the best part is, it's completely accessible. No stairs, good lighting, comfortable seating for people who might need that." People who might need that. She was talking about me like I was an invalid. "I see. And the guest list? There are quite a few names I don't recognize." "Well, we thought it would be nice for you to meet some of the important people in our lives. You know, expand your social circle a bit. Some of Trevor's colleagues are really interesting. They work in arts and culture. And a few of Anthony's photographer friends. We thought you'd enjoy meeting some creative people. What she meant, I realized, was that they had invited people who might be useful to their careers. People who could see them as devoted children caring for their elderly mother. People who could witness their performance of filial responsibility. That's very thoughtful, I said again. Should I bring anything? A dish, perhaps? Oh no, Mom, everything's being catered. Just bring yourself. We want you to be able to relax and enjoy being celebrated. After I hung up, I sat staring at the invitation for a long time. The more I analyzed it, the more I understood their strategy. This wasn't just a birthday party. It was a stage production designed to showcase me as a dependent elderly woman who needed their guidance and care. The venue choice was deliberate, an upscale space that would impress the guests, but also reinforce the narrative that Rebecca and Anthony were successful, responsible adults. The guest list was calculated to include potential witnesses to their devoted care. Even the timing, 2 p.m. on a Saturday, suggested a mature, subdued gathering, rather than a celebration of my actual preferences. I decided to do some reconnaissance. The following Tuesday, I took the subway down to Chelsea and walked past the Morrison event space. It was exactly what I had expected. A converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows. The kind of place that looked great in photographs but felt cold and impersonal in reality. More importantly, I noticed the building across the street housed several businesses, including a law firm that specialized in elder law. The irony wasn't lost on me. That evening, I called Eleanor and asked if she had received an invitation to my party. I did, she said, and something in her tone made me suspicious. It looks like it's going to be quite elegant. Did Rebecca contact you directly about it? Another pause. Well, she did call to ask about your preferences. You know, foods you like. Whether you had any mobility issues she should be aware of when choosing the venue. My blood pressure spiked, but I kept my voice level. What did you tell her? Just that you're very independent, that you like simple foods, that sort of thing. She seemed very concerned about making sure you'd be comfortable. Eleanor had been recruited as an information source, feeding Rebecca details about my habits and preferences that would help them craft their narrative. Even my oldest friend had been turned into a spy. That was thoughtful of her to ask, I managed to say. After that conversation, I began to see the full scope of their preparation. This birthday party was the culmination of months of subtle manipulation, careful positioning, and strategic planning. They weren't just throwing me a party. They were staging an intervention designed to demonstrate my need for their guidance. I realized I needed to understand exactly what they planned to say at this event. Over the next few days, I made careful inquiries with other people who had been invited, framing my questions as excitement about the celebration. Patricia Chen let slip that Rebecca had mentioned wanting to make a speech about family responsibility and planning for the future. Gloria Martinez casually mentioned that Anthony had asked her about her own experience with aging parents and whether she thought older people should live alone. The picture became clearer with each conversation. They were going to use my birthday party as a platform to publicly discuss my housing situation, my independence, and my need for their support. They would do it in front of witnesses, making it difficult for me to object without seeming ungrateful or defensive. It was a sophisticated manipulation, and I had to admit I was impressed by their strategic thinking, even as I was appalled by their complete disregard for my dignity. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated me. I spent the next week finalizing my own preparations. I confirmed my cognitive assessment appointment for Friday morning, the day before the party. I wanted the results fresh in my mind. I also made an appointment with my hairdresser and bought a new dress, something elegant but assertive. If I was going to be the center of attention at this performance, I intended to look the part. Most importantly, I prepared my own speech. If Rebecca and Anthony wanted to use my birthday as an opportunity to discuss my future, I would accommodate them. But the conversation wasn't going to go the way they expected. I also made one additional preparation that they would never see coming. I contacted Maria Santos and asked her to be available by phone during the party, just in case I needed immediate legal advice. The night before my birthday, I stood in my apartment looking out at the city lights, feeling calmer than I had in weeks. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation I had been preparing for, the moment when I would either reclaim control of my life or lose it entirely. Rebecca and Anthony thought they were springing a trap on me, using my own birthday to manipulate me into compliance with their plans. They had carefully constructed a scenario where I would be surrounded by witnesses, caught off guard by their public discussion of my future, and pressured to agree to their suggestions in order to avoid embarrassing myself. But I had news for them. The trap they thought they were setting for me was actually the one I had prepared for them. And tomorrow, they were going to walk right into it. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of November wind that cuts through your coat and reminds you that winter is coming, whether you're ready or not. I woke up early, as always, but instead of my usual contemplative coffee by the window, I moved through my morning routine with the focused energy of someone preparing for battle. The cognitive assessment results from Dr. Elizabeth Harper had arrived by email the previous evening, and they were exactly what I had hoped for. Above average cognitive function for any age group, the report stated. No signs of cognitive decline, dementia, or impaired judgment. Patient demonstrates excellent memory, reasoning skills, and decision-making capacity. I printed 3 copies of the report and slipped one into my purse. Insurance, in case the conversation at my birthday party took the turn I suspected it would. I dressed carefully in my new navy blue dress, sophisticated but not overly formal, with a fitted jacket that made me feel confident and professional. I chose my mother's pearl earrings and the silver watch Walter had given me for our 20th anniversary. I wanted to look like what I was, a competent, dignified woman who was perfectly capable of making her own decisions. The subway ride to Chelsea gave me time to review my mental notes one final time. I knew exactly what Rebecca and Anthony were planning, and I had prepared responses for every likely scenario. More importantly, I had prepared a few surprises of my own. The Morrison event space was exactly as cold and impersonal as it had appeared from the outside, but Rebecca had done her best to warm it up. Round tables draped in white linens, autumn centerpieces with orange and gold flowers, soft lighting that tried to mask the industrial fixtures. A small stage had been set up at one end of the room, complete with a microphone and sound system. They were definitely planning speeches. I arrived precisely on time, 2 p.m., and was greeted by Rebecca and Trevor at the entrance. Rebecca looked nervous despite her bright smile, and Trevor seemed to be playing the role of the supportive son-in-law with theatrical enthusiasm. "Mom, you look absolutely beautiful," Rebecca exclaimed, embracing me with what felt like genuine warmth. For a moment, I almost forgot that this woman was trying to manipulate me out of my home. "The space is lovely, dear," I replied, looking around with apparent appreciation. "You've done such a thoughtful job with the decorations." Anthony appeared at my elbow, camera in hand as always. "Let me get some photos of the birthday girl," he said, and I noticed how he positioned me in front of the elegant backdrop, how he adjusted the lighting to make me look as frail and elderly as possible. Even the photography was part of their narrative. The guests began arriving shortly after I did, and I made a point of circulating among them, observing their interactions with my children and noting which conversations stopped abruptly when I approached. Eleanor was there, of course, along with Patricia and Gloria. Several of Rebecca's colleagues from her tech startup, some of Trevor's graphic design contacts, and a handful of Anthony's photographer friends. What struck me most was how many of these people knew details about my life that I had never shared with them directly. Rebecca's boss mentioned how challenging it must be for me to navigate all those stairs in my building. One of Trevor's clients asked if I had considered moving somewhere more manageable now that I was getting older. They had been briefed. This entire gathering had been primed to reinforce the narrative that I was an elderly woman in need of guidance and care. The lunch was catered from an expensive restaurant in the meatpacking district, food I would never have chosen for myself, but impressive enough to showcase Rebecca and Anthony's success to their guests. I ate sparingly and smiled graciously, playing the role of the grateful mother while internally cataloging every detail of their performance. As the meal wound down, Rebecca stood up and tapped her champagne glass with a fork. The room gradually quieted, and all eyes turned toward the small stage where she now stood, microphone in hand. "I want to thank everyone for coming today to celebrate my mother, Dorothy Kellerman," she began, and her voice carried easily through the sound system. "Mom has always been such an inspiration to our family. A woman who raised 2 children as a single mother after our father died, who dedicated her career to helping vulnerable people as a social worker, who has lived independently and with such dignity." The past tense wasn't lost on me. She was already speaking about my independence as something that belonged to my history, not my present. "But as much as we admire Mom's strength and independence," Rebecca continued, "Anthony and I have been thinking a lot lately about family responsibility, about how we can better support the people we love as they enter different phases of their lives." There it was. The setup. Rebecca's speech continued for several more minutes, touching on themes of changing needs, practical considerations, and planning for the future. She spoke about the challenges of aging in place in New York City, about the importance of family involvement in major life decisions, about the peace of mind that comes from knowing your loved ones are properly supported. She never directly mentioned my apartment or suggested I should move, but the implications were clear to everyone in the room. She was building a case for why a devoted daughter might need to become more involved in her elderly mother's housing decisions. When Rebecca finished, the room erupted in polite applause. Several guests nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by her thoughtful concern for my welfare. Then Anthony took the microphone. His speech was different in tone, but similar in substance. He talked about his photography work, about how documenting real estate had taught him to see the challenges that older residents face in aging buildings. He mentioned safety concerns, accessibility issues, the emotional burden of maintaining a home that might be too large for one person's needs. "I've seen too many families struggle because they waited too long to have these important conversations," he said, looking directly at me with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Mom has given us so much over the years. Now it's our turn to give back, to help her think through what would be best for her future." Again, the message was clear without being explicitly stated. I needed their help to make decisions about my own life. As Anthony wrapped up his speech, I saw several guests glancing in my direction with expressions of sympathy and approval. Rebecca and Anthony had successfully positioned themselves as caring children and me as a vulnerable elderly woman who would benefit from their guidance. The room fell silent as Anthony stepped away from the microphone. This was clearly the moment when I was expected to respond, to thank them for their concern, to acknowledge their wisdom, to agree that perhaps it was time to start having those important conversations about my future. I stood up slowly, using my cane for support even though I didn't really need it. I wanted to look every bit the elderly woman they had described. I made my way to the microphone with deliberate, careful steps, and the room watched with the kind of respectful attention usually reserved for someone delivering a eulogy. I adjusted the microphone to my height and looked out at the assembled guests, my children's colleagues, friends, and witnesses to what they believed would be my capitulation to their plans. "Thank you all so much for being here today," I began, my voice clear and strong despite the tremor I allowed to creep into it. "And thank you, Rebecca and Anthony, for such thoughtful, caring speeches. It's wonderful to know that my children are thinking so carefully about my future." I paused, letting the moment settle, watching Rebecca and Anthony exchange satisfied glances. "You've given me so much to think about," I continued. "And you're absolutely right that this is the perfect time to have important conversations about planning for the future." Rebecca beamed. Anthony nodded encouragingly. The room waited expectantly for my grateful acceptance of their guidance. "Which is why," I said, my voice suddenly becoming much stronger and more authoritative, "I think this is the perfect moment to share some news with all of you." The satisfied expressions on my children's faces began to falter as they realized my tone had shifted completely. "You see, I have been doing quite a bit of planning for the future lately. Just not the kind of planning Rebecca and Anthony might have expected." The room was now completely silent, the air thick with confusion and growing tension. I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope that I had prepared specifically for this moment. "I think it's time we had that important conversation about family responsibility. All of us. Right here. Right now." The trap they had set for me was about to spring shut, but they were the ones caught inside it. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see Rebecca and Anthony exchanging increasingly worried glances as I stood at the microphone, the manila envelope in my hands like a weapon they hadn't seen coming. The guests, who moments before had been nodding along with speeches about my need for guidance, now sat in confused anticipation. I opened the envelope slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment. Inside were copies of documents I had been collecting over the past month. Legal papers, medical reports, financial statements, and a few other surprises that would completely demolish the narrative my children had spent so much time constructing. "You know," I began, my voice now carrying the authority I had developed over 4 decades of advocating for people who couldn't advocate for themselves. "Rebecca and Anthony are absolutely right that we need to have honest conversations about family responsibility and planning for the future. So let's have that conversation, right here, right now, with all of you as witnesses." I pulled out the first document, the cognitive assessment from Dr. Harper. Since there seems to be some concern about my mental capacity to make decisions about my own life, I thought you might all be interested in the results of my recent neuropsychological evaluation. I held up the report so everyone could see the official letterhead. This was conducted 3 days ago by Dr. Elizabeth Harper, one of Manhattan's leading geriatric psychiatrists. I read directly from the summary. Patient demonstrates above-average cognitive function for any age group. No signs of cognitive decline, dementia, or impaired judgment. Patient shows excellent memory, reasoning skills, and decision-making capacity. The color was draining from Rebecca's face. Anthony looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "So we can put to rest any concerns about my mental fitness," I continued cheerfully. "I'm perfectly capable of understanding complex financial and legal matters, making informed decisions about my living situation, and managing my own affairs." I pulled out the second document, a detailed financial statement prepared by my accountant. Since there also seems to be some worry about my ability to maintain my current lifestyle, let me share some information about my financial situation. I adjusted my reading glasses theatrically. My net worth, including my retirement accounts, savings, and insurance policies, is approximately $847,000. My monthly expenses, including my rent-stabilized apartment lease, total $2,100. My monthly income from pensions and Social Security is $3,400. I looked up from the paper and smiled at the room. That leaves me with a surplus of $1,300 every month. Hardly the picture of someone struggling to make ends meet. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was clearly not the conversation they had expected to witness at a birthday party. "But here's where things get really interesting," I continued, pulling out a third set of documents. "I've been doing some research into the rental market on the Upper West Side, and I've learned some fascinating things about the value of rent-stabilized apartments like mine." I held up a real estate report I had commissioned from a professional appraiser. According to this independent assessment, if my apartment were available at market rate, it would rent for approximately $4,800 per month. If it were converted to a co-op and sold, it would likely sell for between $2.80 and $3.2 million. The room was now completely silent, except for the sound of people shifting nervously in their chairs. Now, I started wondering why my children would be so concerned about me living in such a valuable property, especially since I'm clearly capable of affording it and maintaining it. So I did a little more research. I pulled out printouts of social media posts and financial records that I had legally obtained through public sources. "Rebecca, dear, I noticed from your Instagram posts that you and Trevor are paying $4,200 a month for your 1-bedroom apartment in Williamsburg. That's nearly 4 times what I pay for my 3-bedroom apartment in a much more desirable neighborhood. That must be quite a financial strain." Rebecca's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. "And Anthony," I continued, turning to my son, "I learned through mutual acquaintances that you've been struggling with irregular income from your photography work. In fact, you've had to move 3 times in the past 2 years because you couldn't consistently afford rent." Anthony looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. So I began to understand why you might both be so interested in my housing situation. A rent-stabilized apartment worth millions of dollars would certainly solve a lot of financial problems, if only your stubborn mother would cooperate. I paused to let that sink in, then pulled out the most damaging document of all, a printed copy of text messages between Rebecca and Anthony that I had obtained through a private investigator. But then I discovered something that really clarified the situation for me. These are text messages between my two children, discussing their plans for this very birthday party. I began reading from the messages. Rebecca to Anthony. We need to make Mom understand that keeping the apartment is selfish. She doesn't need all that space, and we could really use the money from selling it. Gasps echoed around the room. Rebecca jumped to her feet. Mom, you can't just... I held up my hand to silence her and continued reading. Anthony to Rebecca. If we frame it as being about her safety and well-being, she'll be more likely to go along with it. The birthday party is perfect. Lots of witnesses to see how much we care about her. The reaction from the guests was immediate and audible. Several people began whispering to each other, and I could see the dawning realization in their faces that they had been manipulated into participating in what was essentially an elaborate con game. But my personal favorite, I said, pulling out one final message, is this exchange from last week. Rebecca to Anthony. Once we get her to agree to move, we can convince her to add one of us to the lease before she gives it up. That way we can inherit the tenancy when she dies. The room erupted. Several guests stood up, looking uncomfortable and clearly wanting to leave. Others stared at Rebecca and Anthony with expressions of shock and disgust. The problem with your plan, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos, is that you made several crucial mistakes. First, you underestimated my intelligence. Second, you underestimated my resources. And third, you didn't bother to research the legal requirements for inheriting a rent-stabilized lease. I pulled out one final document. A legal opinion from Maria Santos. According to New York State housing law, succession rights for rent-stabilized apartments require the inheriting family member to have lived with the primary tenant for at least 2 years immediately preceding the tenant's death, and to have been financially dependent on that tenant. Since both of you live independently and have your own incomes, neither of you would qualify to inherit my lease under any circumstances. Anthony finally found his voice. Mom, you don't understand. We were trying to help you. Help me? I interrupted, my voice sharp with anger that I had been holding back for weeks. Help me by lying to me? Help me by manipulating my friends into spying on me? Help me by planning to steal my home out from under me? The room was in chaos now. Several guests were openly staring at Rebecca and Anthony with disgust, while others were gathering their coats and heading for the exits. Let me be very clear about something, I continued, my voice rising above the commotion. I am Dorothy Kellerman. I am 69 years old, I am in excellent health, I am financially secure, and I am mentally competent. I have lived in my apartment for 40 years, and I intend to live there 40 more if I can manage it. I will make my own decisions about my housing, my finances, and my future. And if anyone, family or otherwise, tries to manipulate, coerce, or defraud me out of my home, they will find themselves dealing with my attorney. I held up Maria Santos's business card. Horror. This is Maria Santos, a specialist in elder law and tenant rights. She has all the documentation we've discussed today, plus recordings of several conversations where my children attempted to pressure me into giving up my apartment. If necessary, she's prepared to file charges for attempted elder financial abuse. The room had gone completely silent again. Rebecca was crying now, tears of anger and humiliation streaming down her face. Anthony looked like he might be sick. So, I said, folding all the documents back into the envelope, I think we've had that important conversation about family responsibility and planning for the future. And I think we've all learned something valuable today. I stepped away from the microphone and looked directly at my children. Happy birthday to me, I said quietly. And thank you both for giving me the perfect gift, the gift of finally seeing exactly who you really are. The silence that followed was the sound of a family breaking apart, and the beginning of my new life as a woman who would never again trust anyone else to plan her future. The aftermath of my birthday party was swift and decisive. Within an hour of my revelations, the Morrison event space had emptied, except for Rebecca, Anthony, Trevor, and myself. The catered lunch sat abandoned on elegant tables, the autumn centerpieces now looking more like funeral arrangements than birthday decorations. Rebecca and Anthony sat in stunned silence, while Trevor frantically tried to salvage what remained of their social and professional reputations by making phone calls to the guests who had witnessed their public humiliation. I could hear him in the corner, his voice strained as he attempted damage control. There's obviously some miscommunication. Family dynamics are complicated. I'm sure we can work this out privately. But the damage was done, and we all knew it. I gathered my documents methodically, slipping each piece of evidence back into my manila envelope, like a prosecutor closing a successful case. The cognitive assessment, the financial statements, the legal opinions, the text messages. Each one a nail in the coffin of their manipulation scheme. "Mom," Rebecca finally spoke, her voice small and broken. "Can we please talk about this privately?" I looked at my daughter, this woman I had raised, educated and loved unconditionally, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. "What exactly would you like to discuss, Rebecca? How you plan to steal my home? How you manipulated my friends into spying on me? How you used my birthday as an opportunity to publicly pressure me into compliance?" "We weren't trying to steal anything," Anthony interjected weakly. "We were worried about you living alone, about the stairs, about—" "Stop." My voice cut through his excuses like a blade. "I've heard enough lies from both of you to last several lifetimes. The text messages don't lie, Anthony. Your own words convicted you." I stood up, smoothing my navy dress and collecting my purse. "Here's what's going to happen now. I'm going home to my apartment, MY apartment, where I will continue to live independently for as long as I choose. You will not contact me unless I contact you first. You will not involve my friends in your schemes. You will not discuss my housing situation, my finances, or my future with anyone." Rebecca's tears had turned to anger. "You can't just cut us out of your life. We're your children. You stopped being my children the moment you decided to treat me like a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be respected," I replied. "Children love their parents. What you've been doing is called exploitation." I pulled Maria Santos's business card from my purse and placed it on the table between us. "My attorney has copies of everything we discussed today. If either of you attempts to contact my landlord, my bank, my doctor, or anyone else involved in my affairs, she will file formal charges for attempted elder financial abuse. The evidence is overwhelming, and in New York State, that's a felony." Trevor had finished his phone calls and returned to our table, his face pale. "Dorothy, surely we can work this out as a family." "There is no family here," I said quietly. "There are 3 adults who thought they could manipulate an elderly woman out of her home, and 1 woman who refused to be their victim." I walked toward the exit, then turned back for one final statement. "You know what the irony is? If you had simply been honest with me about your financial struggles, I might have helped you. I might have loaned you money, or co-signed a lease, or found other ways to support you. But you chose deception and manipulation, instead of honesty and respect. You chose to see me as an obstacle instead of as your mother." The silence that followed me out of the Morrison event space was deafening. The subway ride back to the Upper West Side gave me time to process what had just happened. I had spent weeks preparing for this confrontation, but the reality of cutting ties with my own children felt surreal. Part of me, the part that had spent 42 years being Rebecca's mother and 39 years being Anthony's mother, wanted to go back and try to fix this somehow. But the larger part of me, the part that had fought for vulnerable people my entire career, knew that some lines couldn't be uncrossed. What Rebecca and Anthony had done wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a calculated attempt to manipulate me out of my home, using psychological pressure and social coercion. If I forgave this, if I allowed them back into my life without consequences, I would be teaching them that elder abuse was acceptable as long as it was wrapped in concern and executed by family members. When I reached my building on West 78th Street, I climbed those 4 flights of stairs with more energy than I had felt in months. Each step reminded me of what I had fought to protect, not just an apartment, but my independence, my dignity, and my right to make my own choices about my own life. Inside my apartment, I made coffee in Walter's anniversary mug and sat by the east-facing window, watching the late afternoon sun slant through the buildings. My phone rang several times. Rebecca, then Anthony, then Rebecca again, but I let the calls go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear their apologies, their justifications, or their attempts to minimize what they had done. Maybe I never would. The weeks that followed brought unexpected peace. My daily routines resumed their comfortable rhythm without the underlying tension of wondering what Rebecca and Anthony were planning next. I read my morning paper without analyzing every article about housing or elderly care for hidden meanings. I answered my phone without screening calls from my own children. Eleanor called to apologize for her role in gathering information about me. I had no idea what they were really planning, she said, her voice heavy with guilt. Rebecca made it sound like they were trying to plan a surprise that would make you happy. I forgave Eleanor. She had been manipulated just as I had been, used as a tool in my children's scheme without understanding the true purpose. Other friends reached out as well, some to apologize for their unwitting participation, others to express their shock at what they had witnessed at the party. Patricia from the community center said it best. I always thought Rebecca and Anthony were such devoted children. I guess you never really know what goes on in families. My attorney, Maria Santos, called 2 weeks after the birthday party to report that neither Rebecca nor Anthony had made any attempts to contact my landlord, my bank, or any other institutions involved in my affairs. They seem to understand that we're serious about prosecution if they interfere with your independence, she said. I changed my will during that time, removing Rebecca and Anthony as beneficiaries and redirecting my estate to charitable organizations that supported senior housing rights, literacy programs, and social services for vulnerable populations. If my children wanted to profit from my death, they would be disappointed. My legacy would go to people who actually needed help, not people who tried to steal homes from their elderly mothers. By December, I had settled into a new version of my life, one defined by freedom rather than fear. I joined a book club at the local library, started volunteering at a legal aid clinic that helped seniors fight housing discrimination, and even took a watercolor painting class at the community center. For the first time in months, I was living for myself rather than defending myself. The holidays came and went without contact from Rebecca or Anthony. I spent Christmas Day with Eleanor and her family, sharing stories and laughter that felt genuine rather than performed. It was the first holiday in years where I didn't feel like I was being assessed for signs of decline or studied for vulnerabilities to exploit. On New Year's Eve, I stood on my building's roof watching fireworks over the Hudson River, thinking about the year that had passed and the year ahead. I was 69 years old, financially secure, mentally sharp, and completely in control of my own life. Rebecca and Anthony had tried to plan my future without me, treating me like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Their plan had been sophisticated, emotionally manipulative, and probably would have worked on someone who didn't have my professional background in recognizing abuse. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated Dorothy Kellerman. As I write this, 6 months after my birthday party, I'm still living in my rent-stabilized apartment on West 78th Street. I still climb those 4 flights of stairs every day, still tend my small rooftop garden, still meet Eleanor for coffee on Tuesdays. My children have not contacted me, and I have not contacted them. Sometimes I wonder if they've learned anything from this experience. If they understand that love without respect is just another form of abuse. But mostly, I don't think about them at all. Instead, I think about the future future, planned by ME, for ME. I think about the books I want to read, the places I want to visit, the causes I want to support. I think about how many more years I might have in this apartment that has been my home for 4 decades. They planned my birthday without me, so I planned their eviction from my life without them. And for the first time in years, every morning feels like a celebration. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.